Ezra and Nehemiah. You remember the Jewish people of Judah had been taken into exile by Babylon, right? Does this story sound familiar? We've talked about it. Babylon conquers the kingdom of Judah. They deport the best and brightest to Babylon. And then eventually the Babylonians lose to the Persians, a guy named Cyrus. And after the Babylonians are defeated by the Persians, this guy Cyrus, in this period here, the 500s to 400s, says to the people from Judah, you can go back home. And not only can you go back home, you can rebuild your temple, and you can rebuild your city, and you can begin to have a life there again. You're still our subjects. We still sort of tell you what to do, but we're allowing you to go home and start over. You can build your temple. You can worship your God. You can create a new city wall. You can do all those sorts of things. The book of Nehemiah is about building that city wall to protect Jerusalem. All right, so they're allowed to go back home. Actually, in the Hebrew Scriptures, over kings like Cyrus, they actually use a word for this in the Hebrew Scriptures. Cyrus was a Messiah, which later in the New Testament, becomes this bigger. New Testament era becomes this bigger idea. But they saw Cyrus as a Messiah because they had been taken away. Their temple had been razed and burned to the ground, and now Cyrus is sending them back home. And so they go back home, and they begin to try to rebuild their temple and rebuild their city and rebuild their lives. But something happens. They begin to realize that if we go back, the danger here has always been when you are taken from your land and you are put in new land with new customs and new rules and new languages, what is the danger there? You might forget. You might forget your stories. You might forget what sets you apart as a people. You might forget what made you unique. And so when they come back to the land, one of the things they want to do is make sure that they protect their unique ethnic identity. They want to make sure that nobody is going to mess that up, right? This is where circumcision becomes a big deal. This is where food laws become a big deal, right? We don't eat the foods that everybody else eats. We are pure. We are ritually clean and pure. We don't do things that other people do. And when they get back to the land, they begin to sort of blame. The reason we got punished is because we weren't faithful to these laws. Right, because people are always looking for why something bad has happened. So we weren't faithful to our laws. We weren't faithful to the Torah, to the first 5 books. And so God punished us. So now we need to make sure we're faithful to the Torah. And we need to make sure we're a people set apart. We need to make sure that we are this unique, ethnic, religious group of people that we were before. And the only problem is that while they were in captivity, some of them married people who weren't Jewish. They weren't Judahite, is what they would have been called then. What do you do with that? They had children, they built lives, and then they come back home. Well, in Ezra and Nehemiah, it was known as and by the way, in the Hebrew Bible, that's one book. We have it as separate books in our Bible. It's one book, one story. And during this period, they're known as the reforms of Ezra and Nehemiah. They sort of take a hard line. Notice this text. Then Shecaniah, Jehiel's son, from the family of Elam, spoke up and said to Ezra, "We've been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women from the neighboring peoples. But even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. Let's now make a covenant with our God to send away all these wives and their children." Did anybody's stomach just turn a bit? Whose children? Their children. These aren't our children. These are children that were had by these foreign wives who now we need to get rid of because they are keeping us from being clean and pure and right with God. Ezra 10, Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, "You have been unfaithful by marrying foreign women and adding to Israel's guilt. But now make a confession to the Lord God of your ancestors and do his will. Separate yourselves from the neighboring peoples and from the foreign wives." By the way, when it says send away, this is a technical term, and it means divorce. What happens to a woman in this context if she's just sort of left on her own without anyone to care for her? She's in trouble, right? The kids are in trouble. But they're saying our religion demands that we just send them away because they're not pure and righteous and good like we want to be. Nehemiah. On that day when the scroll from Moses was being read to the people, they found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter God's assembly. Where's Ruth from? Moab. Nobody from Moab can set foot in God's assembly. If you're from Moab, you're out. Ruth was from Moab. This is because they hadn't met the Israelites with food and water, but instead hired Balaam. That's another really fun story where the donkey speaks. hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they separated out from Israel all those of mixed descent. Are you totally and purely one of us? Or is there something in you that makes you less than one of us? Also in those days, this is Nehemiah, I saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of various peoples. They couldn't speak the language of Judah. Now, how many of you have ever heard somebody say this? If they can't speak our language, they don't need to be here. This is what they're saying. They can't speak Judah. They can't speak American. They got to go. Right? That's what they're saying in this text. So this is a great line. So I scolded them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. That's what you do, right? That's what you teach your kids to do when somebody does something they don't like. You scold them. You curse them. You beat some of them. Not all of them. That'd be crazy. And then you pull out their hair. Also, I made them swear a solemn pledge in the name of God, saying, you won't give your daughters to their sons in marriage or take their daughters in marriage for your sons or yourselves. Didn't Israel's King Solomon sin on account of such women? Among the many nations, there was no king like him. He was well loved by his God, and God made him king over Israel. Yet foreign wives led even him into sin. Should we then listen to you and do all this great evil, acting unfaithfully toward our God by marrying foreign women? I mean, this is a polemic against people who aren't from around here. It's a polemic of people who aren't like us. They aren't like us, and we need to get rid of them. They aren't like us, and they shouldn't have no part in our community. That's the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. And during this period of time, somebody sat down and wrote the story of Ruth, a Moabite who rescues a Jewish family line. And then the book of Ruth ends with a genealogy. How many of you get fired up about genealogies? Like, you just love to read them. Especially, you don't just love to read them. You want to make it extra hard. So you go get the King James Bible out, and you're begatting all over the place. Right? I mean, when we tend to run on these genealogies, we think they're boring. All right, Matthew begins with a genealogy of Jesus that actually, shockingly, includes Ruth. But he begins with a genealogy, and we tend to skip over that. And but what about the baby? But the genealogies in the Hebrew Bible are super, in the New Testament, are super important because they're not they're far more theological than they are historical. They're making a claim. And here's the genealogy that comes at the end of the book of Ruth. But before we read that, this quote by Richard Orr: scapegoating, exporting our unresolved hurt, is the most common storyline of human history. That's what's happening in Ezra and Nehemiah, isn't it? We have problems, and we need to find a way to blame someone for those problems. And Lord knows we don't want to take all the blame ourselves. So we'll say it's our fault because of those people. And if we could get rid of those people, then we wouldn't have any sin. We wouldn't have any problem. We'd have a pure group, pure land, pure people, pure everything. If we could just get rid of those people who need to be gotten rid of. That's scapegoating. Right? That's scapegoating. And what happens when this is not just an American problem. This is a human problem. I mean, I think you can make the case that scapegoating is the original sin. Right? I mean, you go to the Genesis 3 story, and they eat the fruit they shouldn't eat. And what's the first thing that happens? Did you do it? No, she made me do it. Did you do this? Yes, but the snake. Right? What is that? It's scapegoating. It's pushing off the pain. It's pushing off the blame. It's saying if it wasn't for the snake, this would never have happened. If it weren't for those people, this would never happen. And we live in a cultural time where those people could be just about anybody, depending on where you stand, right? I mean, we live in a political era right now where people on both sides are doing some really heinous things to each other because of those people. And this creates a tension and a problem and a pain, and we're going to continually pass that buck unless we learn how to deal with it. Right? The thing that makes the Jesus story compelling is, what does Jesus do? He's scapegoated, and he just absorbs it. He doesn't pass the pain on. He takes it, and he dies with it. And in his dying breath, he forgives. Right? Jesus is teaching us how to deal with this human problem of scapegoating. And we do it in every possible way. How many of you have a sports team that disappointed you at one point or the other? No West Virginia fans in the room. That's cool. I get it. But you know what happens? You want to blame somebody, so you got to blame the coach. Or usually you got to blame the referee. Right? Y'all UK fans, a lot of you, I've heard you blame the referee. It's always the referee's fault when you lose, right? It's never the fact that you didn't play well. It's that referee. And the reality is, in minor trivial ways and in big geopolitical ways, we're always blaming somebody else and never taking responsibility for our own role in why this whole thing got messed up. And so the book of Ruth is in conversation with the book of Nehemiah and Ezra, pushing back on this scapegoating of people who aren't from around here. And notice this in the book of Ruth. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He was intimate with her. And the Lord let her become pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "May the Lord be blessed, who today hasn't left you without a redeemer." That word redeemer, in the idea of levirate marriage, you had somebody, the person who took on responsibility for the woman was known as a goel, which is known as a kinsman redeemer, somebody who rescued the family from peril. May his name be proclaimed in Israel. He will restore your life and sustain you in your old age. Your daughter-in-law who loves you has given birth to him. She's better for you than 7 sons. Naomi took the child and held him to her breast, and she became his guardian. The neighborhood women gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." Because again, this in some ways replaces this. It's not a replace, but you see, he's standing for the son she lost. He's been given back to her. His name was Obed. He became Jesse's father and David's grandfather. And then you come to the line. These are the generations of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram. Ram the father of Amminadab. Amminadab the father of Nahshon. Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon the father of Boaz. Boaz the father of Obed. Obed the father of Jesse. And Jesse the father of David. And this is when the writer drops the pen and walks away. What is the claim being made here? Our greatest king, the guy who united us as a people from being 12 separate tribes, brought us together and created a country and created in some ways an empire. The guy we look to and long for. We want David's days to come back. We want David's leadership to come back. We want David again. That guy, his great-great-grandmother was a Moabite. Which means David is part what? Moabite. It's like finding out that your last name is Hatfield, but that somewhere way back when somebody married a McCoy. Right? It's finding out that your enemy is part of you. Your David's great-great-grandmother, our greatest king, the one we idealize and want to have an exact carbon copy of him come back. That guy isn't allowed to set foot in the assembly of God. He's the greatest. He's a man after God's heart. He's got some Moabite in him. Do you see what's being pushed back on here? Do you see what the story of Ruth is doing? That Ruth, the Moabite, is the great-great-grandmother of David? I think the story of Ruth is a challenge to the dominant conventional wisdom of the day. The conventional wisdom of the day was Moabites are bad. Foreign people are bad. Foreign women are bad. The children they give birth to are bad. And Ruth's saying, hey, you need to be careful because you don't know when or where that you might need to be saved by one of those bad people. That the people you've scapegoated and sent away may be the people that end up saving your life in the long run. Man, isn't this a challenging story? Because everybody's got a Moabite. You've got a Moabite in your life. It's a person or a people or a group of people or people who vote a certain way or people who worship a certain way, people who love a certain way. Like there's a group of people in your world that you kind of want to look at and say, well, they're the problem. If we could just get rid of the Moabites, we'd be okay. And this story says to us, no. And by the way, you might be somebody's Moabite. Right? You may be in a group of people that somebody's like, we got to get rid of them. If we could get rid